Hi, today we're going to be discussing a fault-tolerant API strategy called the Opportunistic Parallel Invocation Strategy. So essentially what this pattern is, Opportunistic. So essentially this pattern is going to be very similar to the fallback API strategy, in which case we're going to have a secondary copy of an API that's going to be very similar or exactly the same as the primary copy. And it will allow you to go and basically call both of those endpoints at once. Now, keep in mind that this strategy is going to be very intensive on your actual application network, so you want to make sure you're using this sparingly. And the only times you'd be actually using it is when you have a very high probability that one or both of those replicas of the APIs are going to fail. So if we want to talk about our goals for this actual pattern, it's going to be to provide an alternate endpoint to be called in parallel with the primary API to provide a better chance of a success message. Okay, so let's take a look at what this pattern is actually going to look like in practice. Essentially, we're going to need 4 different parts. So we're going to start off with our client that's actually going to be calling these APIs. We're going to have our fault-tolerant API. This is going to be the API that's actually going to invoke this strategy. And then we're actually going to have our primary API. And our fallback API. So what's going to happen here is that we're going to go and have the client go and call our fault-tolerant API, which will then, in parallel, go and call both the primary API and the fallback API. So now what's going to happen here is both of these APIs are going to be processing the requests at the same time. And whoever returns back the response first is who's going to actually get the response passed back to the client. So in this case, let's say, for instance, the primary API comes back first. That response is what's going to go back to the client. Even if we were to go back and this fallback API were to have a success message come back, but it got in there second, it's not going to be passed back. We're only going to pass back one message back to the primary client. Now, some considerations that you need to make sure that you're going to take into account. So the first one we want to talk about is one of the things that I mentioned before. This is generally only going to be if you have an extremely high probability of an API failing. Another thing you want to make sure is that if you're going to invoke this strategy, that you make sure that your application network has sufficient bandwidth to be able to handle these requests. Say, for instance, these are going to be passing back very large payloads, which is generally where you actually do have the most chance for failures when you have very large payloads. It's going to take a large toll on your network to be able to pass these back. So you want to make sure that you have enough bandwidth in your network. Now, real quickly, let's discuss what is actually going to make a good fallback API. So, some examples of a fallback API could be, firstly, a deprecated API that maybe we just added a little extra performance improvements and things like that to the primary API. So we'll call that one a deprecated API. Secondly, say for instance you were able to be lucky enough to have a disaster recovery site for all your APIs, and you have a replica of that. So if we had a DR replica, we could go and call that replica over in the disaster recovery site. Thirdly, if we maybe have an API that actually is more powerful and actually will return more data than is actually needed than the primary API. So that would make that a superset of the primary API. That could be another one we could call. And then lastly, though not the most ideal, if we had an API that was a subset of our API, so maybe it would return some of the data but not all of the data, that could be another option. It's better than not having any results at all, but again, it's not ideal. So this one would be called a subset API. So, in summary, we've got our opportunistic parallel invocation API, which is essentially going to be our fallback API strategy, where we're going to actually go and call the primary and the fallback APIs at the same time in hopes of getting a response back. Keep in mind that this should only be used for a high probability of a failure, and it's very taxing on your networks. So you want to make sure you've got enough network bandwidth to be able to handle this request. Some of the examples of what a fallback API could be are a deprecated API that maybe isn't quite as performant. We could have an exact replica over in a DR site if you have one, or a superset or a subset of those APIs. So with that being said, that's our opportunistic parallel invocation. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.